Sorry, it's a great pleasure to introduce a panel to discuss Hans Kundnani's book. If I may, I'm just stealing it for a second, Eurowhiteness, Culture, Empire, and Race in the European Project, which really is a fascinating read. And I'm looking very much forward for Hans presenting it to a panel here and then opening up for broader Q&A. So Hans Kundnani is an associate fellow in the Europe program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as Chatham House, though this discussion here will not be under Chatham House rules, if I may, and a visiting professor at the College of Europe. I don't want to give too much away talking about the book, but just saying that I really was very much enjoying reading it, given that he pursues an argument of the imperial amnesia in Europe, and he really draws our attention to the racial and ethnic dimensions of European integration. So really he pushes actually the reader very much to try to distinguish between what is myth in European integration theories and thinking and what is actually history. And he does so eloquently, if I may say, as a tour de force, really spanning centuries, looking at the different natural histories and also looking at different policy domains and looking into how this Euro-whiteness actually manifests itself in issues of economic policy, foreign policy, migration policy. And so after Hans will present his argument to us in about 20 minutes or so, we then open up to this distinguished panel of, if I may put it in footnotes, female scholars, not footnotes, really, they're female scholars who engage with the argument. And we're going to start off with Calypso Nicolaidis, who sits here to my right, who is the chair in global affairs at the School of Transnational Governance here at the EUI, and also convenes the Democracy Forum here. And her research expertise really is as broad, I cannot enumerate it all, but maybe something that will speak to Hans's book today is the project she works on under the heading of Decentering Europe. Then next, after Calypso, we'll have Miriam Mukulazzi, who is a Max Weber Fellow here at the Robert Schuman Center at the EUI, and an expert in regionalism studies, something that also speaks heavily to Hans's book, particularly working on the European Union and the African Union, but also on security policy and feminist foreign policy. So I think dimensions, again, that can actually relate to Hans's project. And last but not least, to my left, Glenda Sluga, who is the joint chair and professor of international history and capitalism at the history department and the Robert Schuman Center, and has been working on the history of international orders of the 19th and 20th century, but also very much has a big ERC project working on international economic thought and globalization. So it's a huge pleasure to have all of you here. And with no further ado, Hans, the floor is yours, and please.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's my first time here. I can remember my friend Ken Endo, who I think some of you will know, telling me that this is the university that is closest to heaven.
We're in a chapel.
I'm going to come on to that in a minute. Maybe slightly less close to heaven in November than in spring or summer, I don't know. But yes, and as you say, it seems particularly appropriate that we're having this discussion in the Capella. Those of you that have read the book will know what I mean, but for those of you that haven't, it will become clear when I talk about the book. And so, as Stephanie said, it's a short book. It covers quite a lot of ground, and I'm going to give an even shorter presentation. So I'll sort of try to summarise not all of the argument, but some of the argument. And I should say as well as, as I say, it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm slightly apprehensive about this discussion, because I think of all of the places that I've presented this book in the last couple of months, this audience is probably more knowledgeable about the EU than almost any other audience I've presented it to, apart from perhaps in Brussels. And it may also be one of the most, I think, pro-European audiences that I've presented it to. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, but also slightly a little bit apprehensive about it. So yeah, as I say, I'll try to whiz through the main sort of the main thrust of the argument in the book. So it's basically a book about the history of ideas of Europe. Through history, and then it tries to explore where the European Union fits into that much longer history of ideas of Europe. And the basic kind of distinction that I make is between, on the one hand, ethnic cultural ideas of Europe, and on the other hand, civic ideas of Europe. And in doing so, I'm drawing on a distinction from the study of nationalism, in particular Hans Korn's book from 1944, The Idea of Nationalism, where he distinguishes between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. And I'm essentially applying that to Europe and to the EU, with the idea that the EU is an expression of regionalism, to go back to the idea of regionalism studies. And the idea is essentially that we should think of the EU and Europe as an expression of regionalism, rather than, for example, as some people have wanted to imagine the EU as an expression of cosmopolitanism. It seems to me that regionalism is a more helpful way to think about Europe and the EU, in particular because I think the implication of that is that it's not the opposite of nationalism, which I think is how a lot of pro-Europeans want to think about the EU, but it's actually analogous to it, except on a larger continental scale. And so what I think that means then is that you can take a lot of the concepts and theories that we have from the study of nationalism and at least think about whether they apply to Europe and the EU. So, for example, just as Benedict Anderson argued that nations are imagined communities, I think you can think of the EU or Europe as an imagined community as well. In particular, as I've already said, I take this distinction between ethnic, cultural, and civic ideas, and apply that to regionalism. And really, I try to show how there's this complex interaction of those ethnic cultural and civic ideas of nationalism, of regionalism throughout that history, in the same way that there is in the history of nations. So the story begins really in the medieval period. Obviously the name Europe and the idea of Europe as a space comes from classical antiquity, but it's really only in the medieval period that people are identified as Europeans. In other words, the beginning of the idea of European identity. The first reference, as I'm sure many of you know, is that as far as we can tell, is in the Mozarabic Chronicle in the 8th century. And I think it's worth stressing that in that first reference, Europeans are opposed to Arabs, and so that opposition, that othering, I think is there from the beginning. And it seems to me that throughout really the medieval period, and this is I think the relevance of the Capella, is that at that time it's a fairly straightforward idea of Europeanness, which is roughly synonymous with Christianity. And I guess the sort of embodiment of that medieval idea of Europeanness that's synonymous with Christianity is Charlemagne, who obviously then becomes this inspirational figure for the post-World War II integration project. In the modern period, you then get, and obviously I'm really compressing a very complex long history here. In the modern period, you then get a new, much more complex idea of European identity, which partly emerges in the context of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So it's a rationalist idea, a secular idea of Europe, as opposed to a religious one. It seems to me that a lot of people kind of stop there. It seems to me you have to also say that it also emerges in the context of the encounter by Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia and, above all, the Americas. In other words, the context in which whiteness emerges. And so, as well as being a rationalist, secular idea of Europe as opposed to a racial one, it also seems to me to be a racialized idea of Europe. And those two things, the rationalist and the racialization, I think go together. And so the question then becomes, and really this is the question that I try to answer in the book, is, well, what happens after 1945? Do those ethnic cultural ideas of Europe connected to Christianity and to whiteness, do they simply disappear? after 1945, which I think is how a lot of pro-Europeans want to think of this. In a way, it's the story that the EU tells about itself, that a kind of new, purely civic idea of Europe emerges, centred on what becomes the EU, that has nothing to do with these older ethnic, cultural ideas. Even though, as I've already suggested, they draw on these older ideas, as the example of Charlemagne illustrates. So, my argument essentially is that the history is much messier, that it's not as if we can think of 1945 as a kind of an hour zero from which this, to put it in the words of Edgar Morin, a butterfly emerges from the chrysalis. It's a much messier kind of history. I try to then tell that history, and I do that in three phases. The sort of periodization that I then have for the post-war European project in relation to these questions is in these three phases. So the first phase is roughly from 1945 until the end of the Cold War. And that phase, and here I'm really drawing on Pio's work and that of other scholars, and I should say, Pio's work has been really transformational for me. It was one of the things that led me to start thinking about these questions more and ultimately to write the book. We now know that the EU begins as a colonial project. A lot of pro-Europeans want to imagine that it's a post-colonial project. That's just historically wrong, because the early phase of European integration intersects with the end of European colonialism. But it's not just that. It's not just that it's not a post-colonial project in the chronological sense. It's also that part of the point of European integration in that period, in the 1950s, was for France and Belgium to consolidate, to integrate, if you like, their remaining colonies in West and Central Africa at a time when they were no longer able to maintain them on their own. This is what I call the original sin of European integration, consciously analogizing to the role of slavery in the founding of the United States. I won't say much more about that because, as I say here, I'm really just reproducing and summarising work that's been done by Pio and others. That colonial project obviously ends by around about 1960. I think there's still a question about, whether after that the EEC and then the EC and then the EU is in some sense neo-colonial, but as a formal colonial project, that period ends in round about in 1960. And I think in that context, you do then start to get a new, much more civic regionalism, which is based in particular on the social market economy and the welfare state and this depoliticised mode of governance that European integration produces. And in that context, though, the history of European colonialism seems to me to be, and the role of the EU in it, or the predecessors of the EU in it, is then completely forgotten. Even as from the 1960s onwards, the Holocaust becomes increasingly sort of incorporated into the narrative of European integration. I think here particularly of Tony Judd, saying that Holocaust recognition is our contemporary European entry ticket. It becomes really central to the way that Europeans think about themselves and the idea of the EU itself and the function of the EU, as it were. And so the way I think about this is that, the EU thinks of itself as being based on the internal lessons of European history. In other words, what Europeans did to each other, that is centuries of conflict culminating in World War II and the Holocaust. And the Holocaust fits very neatly, it seems to me, in that story, not least because the Holocaust takes place in the context of World War II. So European integration, the story it tells about itself is based on these internal lessons of European history, but not on what you might call the external lessons of European history. In other words, what Europeans did to the rest of the world. And I think that's not a coincidence. It seems to me that there's something structural going on here, which is that European integration encourages European countries to think about their history in terms of their relationships with each other. As I say, the centuries of conflict culminating in World War II and the Holocaust, rather than their interactions with the rest of the world. So there's this sort of tendency, which I think actually becomes strengthened by the inclusion of the Holocaust in the narrative, to think about European history as a kind of closed system, right, as kind of self-contained history that has nothing to do with the histories of Africa and the Middle East in particular. And this is why I argue in the book, as Stephanie said, that the EU kind of becomes a vehicle for imperial amnesia. Timothy Snyder talks about the European integration as a soft landing after empire. I think, it's a soft landing that allows Europeans to escape their colonial history. So that's the first phase, roughly until the end of the Cold War. I think then after the end of the Cold War, for the sort of 20-year period after the end of the Cold War, you get this second phase, which, during which the EU, as it then becomes, is in this kind of expansive, optimistic mode as it enlarges to include Central and Eastern European countries. And in that context, it seems to me that pro-Europeans start to imagine that they can almost remake the whole world in the image of the EU. I can't help but think of the book by my former boss at ECFR, Mark Leonard, Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century, which I think very neatly captures that kind of moment and that aspiration, as I say, to sort of remake the world in the image of the EU. Now, it seems to me that there are at least kind of two problems with that. The first is that in that context, there is, I think, the revival of the idea of a European civilizing mission. And here I've been introduced by another person around the table, Jan Zielonka, who's written about this. This new sort of postmodern or technocratic civilizing mission in Central and Eastern Europe during the enlargement process. But it's also during that 20-year period after the end of the Cold War that you start to get all these theories about the EU as an actor in international politics, particularly the idea of the EU as a normative power, which obviously builds on older theories about the EU as a civilian power. And I think they also have this kind of idea of sort of civilizing international politics itself. And so I think you get this, you get this revival of the idea of a European civilizing mission in these multiple ways. And obviously that's seems to me one of the long continuities in the history of the idea of Europe, going all the way back to the medieval period when obviously it's a religious mission. And then in the modern period where it's, a more secular civilizing mission, the kind of civilizing mission that we're all much more familiar with in the context of European colonialism. But it seems to me that's an example of the kind of aspects of thinking about Europe that doesn't just end in 1945. It continues and persists in a new form in the context of European integration. I think it's very hard not to see it in that way. The second problem, though, it seems to me, is that as the borders of the EU to the east soften, as the EU enlarges to include Central and Eastern European countries, its borders to the south remain hard. So Morocco, for example, applies to join the EC in 1987 and is just told that you can't because you're not a European state. Even though, I think a year before that, Spain had joined the EC and it has territory in Morocco, right? Which then becomes part of the EC. And so I think that contrast between the softening of borders to the east and the hardening of borders to the south does strengthen the idea that this is a white bloc. And that brings me then finally to the third and final phase in the story I tell, which is roughly what's happened since 2010. And it seems to me that in 2010, with the beginning of the Euro crisis, that expansive, optimistic moment that you have for 20 years after the end of the Cold War comes to a rather abrupt end. The Euro crisis and then the series of other crises that then follow on, the Arab Spring and then the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, seem to me put the EU into this much more defensive kind of mode. And it starts to see itself as being surrounded by threats. And so you start to get this whole language around protection, which becomes really strong, I think, within the EU. And then I think the second critical juncture in that period, perhaps even more important, is the refugee crisis in 2015. And from that moment on, it seems to me that the EU starts to imagine these threats in civilizational terms. This is what I call the civilizational turn in the European project. And in a way, this is really the reason I wrote the book, was to try to draw attention to this. This is the sort of political urgency, if you like, behind the book, to sort of suggest that during the last decade, and especially since 2015, the EU has been moving in a really problematic direction. This is obviously against the background of the rise of the far right throughout Europe. And, we thought for a long time that, for example, Germany was an exception here. It's now clear that it's not. But perhaps as important, or even more important than the rise of the far right itself, it seems to me it's the way that the centre-right across Europe, I think, has been mimicking the rhetoric and the policies of the far right. Obviously, there's a huge amount of academic research on this, on the sort of normalisation and mainstreaming of far right ideas, especially on these questions around identity and immigration and Islam. And as Stephanie said, you see this, I think, in multiple policy areas. The most obvious one, obviously, is refugee policy. I can say more in the discussion about how that's evolved during the last decade. But obviously, 28,000 people now have died in the Mediterranean since 2014. It's not even just the brutality of the policy, though; it's the way that it's framed. So in the European Commission now, since 2019, the Ursula von der Leyen Commission, you have a European Commissioner for promoting the European way of life, whose job is, at least in part, to keep migrants out, which I think makes it very clear that migrants, and by the way here, obviously this is migrants from the south rather than migrants from the east, are a threat to the European way of life. That, is, I think, very explicit civilizational framing. But I think you also see this civilizational turn, for example, in European foreign policy debates. Here, I think, Macron is actually quite an interesting case. In other words, it's not just the far right. It's centre-right figures. The way that Macron talks about international politics as essentially a clash of civilizations. And interestingly here, this is slightly different from the Huntington version in the sense that Europe here is a distinct civilization. It's distinct from the United States, right? It's not the West against China and Islam. Europe is a distinct civilization that is in part being threatened by the United States, right? So this is a slightly different kind of civilizationalism. It's a European civilizationalism rather than a Western civilizationalism, but it's civilizationalism nevertheless. And this is really where I'll end. The conclusion that I essentially draw is that these ethnic cultural ideas of Europe, rather than getting weaker, may now be getting stronger within the European project. And it's these ethnic cultural ideas of Europe connected to Christianity, connected to whiteness, that I call Eurowhiteness. I think I'll stop there. I can say more in the discussion afterwards about what I think has happened since I finished writing the book, which was roughly in sort of March. But I do feel as if some of the trends that I've been describing have gone even further. In other words, something even beyond what I call the civilizational turn has happened as the far right has become even stronger. I think Meloni is the paradigmatic figure, and since we're in Italy, it seems appropriate to talk about that. But I'll leave that for the discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much also for some pointers, for some questions that we can ask you. Calypso, please.
Yes, thanks, Hans. This is indeed a great and ambitious book, and it's indeed, as you stressed earlier, wonderful that you presented here with us at EUI, which is, after all, the place where we are supposed to be the most Eurocentric, and yet you might have overestimated or buying somehow the narrative that our center and our funders, our core funders, might suggest. So my first point would be to say that I think that if sitting in this room here, and I'm looking around of all our friends and colleagues as well as visitors like Pionniers, we're pretty much, many of us at least, and I'm not going to speak in other people's name, but on this wavelength. So that would be my first point, as probably you won't find any of your three. Sorry, I don't want to anticipate what my wonderful women colleagues. You have 4 women discussing this, which is in itself interesting. But without preempting, this is pretty much an open door here. That I think is the first thing I want to say, although I don't want to try to speak in everybody's name. which is why, and I want to say this, and including for me, because where I want to push back a bit here and there, it's not about the big message of basically, the amnesia of the European project, but it's about nuances and balancing and this kind. The second point I want to make is the title of the book, Whiteness. And you yourself spoke of whiteness the first time you really kind of delved into it when you were going to the south of Europe, and you said, well, if we're resistant to enlargement to the south, it must be whiteness. Now, that's an interesting issue, because I would argue that it's above all religious, and Islam, as someone who's worked on Turkey for so long. And so that one question is whether the book overemphasized the pure race issue as opposed to, us versus the world, our relationship with our colonies, and indeed Eurocentrism itself. And indeed you went back to the pre-Middle Ages, or the encounter with Islam, which is foundational and probably more important than race, because there are lots of white Muslims, and so what do we do there? Turks are often considered, for instance, as white Muslims, and of course there are non-whites, many who are not, Muslim, and the relationship is different. So that's one issue for us to consider, the relationship between race and religion in this story. Thirdly, I think it's important to pay attention to the whole argument of the book for the reason that Stephanie alluded to in introducing me, is that there is a whole prescriptive dimension, which probably we might want to get into in our conversation. Once we take in that story, what do we do? And that was, linking the analysis and the history with the prescription was kind of the idea of this project that I founded 20 years ago called Renew, Rethinking Europe in a Non-European World. That was the predecessor of decentering, but it led us to advocate decentering in European foreign policy. And here it leads me to what links the analysis and the policy is that, to some extent your book is quite Eurocentric, because a lot of this story is what I call reversing the gaze, is to ask, okay, how does the rest of the world see it, perceive it, which should be at the center of the analysis. So again, we could talk about that. Now, coming to some of your points, I guess the main point I would like to make throughout is that sometimes shouldn't we kind of move a bit beyond binaries? So you start us with the frame, regionalism versus cosmopolitics. And indeed, I share absolutely your critique that Europe, the EU project, always risks being captured by what I call the obsession of oneness, and the fact that our dear Euro-federalists will want Europe to be a country, a nation. Or Dominique Strauss-Kahn, he wrote a book once that was called La Nation Européenne. But really, is that the kind of mainstream discourse in Europe? I don't think so. But perhaps because I'm a statist in IR, theory. We live in a state-centric world. Whether we like it or not is a different question. But our world is led by states, and the member states are very jealous of their sovereignty. And frankly, the dominant discourse in Brussels is not Europe as a country, nationalism at the regional level. Doesn't mean we shouldn't always push back against this, because of course, those of us who pushed back against Derrida and Habermas 2003, when they decreed that the Europe nation was created, it was indeed exactly in the name that any nation in the making is based on othering. And the only other the EU should have is its own past, which is partly the story of your book. But many of us push back. So to say that this is like the dominant thing, I think is a real problem. And instead, for me, it's probably more to the point to kind of show how you've got all these contested imaginaries of Europe, one of which is a nation at the regional level. And indeed, and that leads to other elements of tension, superiority complex and inferiority complex, ethnic and civic. And I think that the fact that the EU is a bundle of tensions is probably closer for me to what we should say. But of course, when you write a book like this, you want to make a splash. You put the argument in stark term. I understand, but I would. What? Okay, you have to have a thesis, and it doesn't sell as well to have a thesis about how everything is balanced and contested and complex. I agree with that, but at least that's what I would want to argue. And I'll end on the renew. But let me say before something about the history. Okay, let's not go back to the long history, but post 45. Indeed, this story of the virgin birth. So you're a butterfly. I call the virgin birth in the book Echoes of Empire. But here again, what I find fascinating in the 60s, and Pio writes on this too, but is that virgin birth, that forgetting and amnesia of the colonial, was actually also combined as of the 60s with a whole atonement strategy. Now, we may decide that an atonement through all of the trade and development agreements, and we may decide that these were neo-colonial, and a lot of the analysis, yes, definitely, in part. But there was also distribution of funding, etc., and a discourse of atonement. We're going to make up for our sins, all of us, when we sin, don't we want to atone one way or another? No, I'm not. This is just a joke. No, who wants to atone for their sin? So that's, again, a bit more subtle. I mean, it didn't manage, and certainly didn't manage in the name of, the rest of the world, certainly not on the African continent. At STG, we have a wonderful young African program, and we always discuss the post-colonial, and we're in 2023, and it's not, certainly not forgotten. Now, and this is where I come to the second point about history, the post-colonial project. You say some people, so I felt a bit like targeted here because I do call the EU, or call for the EU to reckon with its post-colonial condition. But I would, encourage us to take the meaning of post in at least two ways. Post in the pure formal way that we live in an era after formal colonialism, but with all of the séquelles and the legacy, and this mean of colonialism, and this indeed means neo-colonialism. That's the descriptive analytical plane, and then post-colonial in the kind of aspirations often sent by the rest of the world. Can we transcend this condition? So this is more of the prescriptive normative dimension. So this term post is very rich, and I think we can make, a lot from it, and your book helps enormously to do that. But that's the question. So if the EU is a community of memory, it's a community of memory from the 20th century, not the 19th century. And how can it be post-colonial? By reinvesting its memory. And this is where your book is so important for this project. You said that then only later did the EU become missionary. I think the missionary character of the EU is right from the beginning. But this is about chronology. Again, Cold War. So reproducing civilizing mission tropes. Fascinating, and yes, with Jan we had many issues, many discussions on enlargement, but neighborhood policy, etc. I think it's fair to say that we really need to disaggregate. There are ways in which the EU reproduces a standard of civilization approach and where it doesn't. And again, so this is it depends. And so, okay, I will skip then the contemporary, simply to end on, indeed, where I think we can all converge and where you're so right to ring the alarm, the refugee crisis, and the extent to which the refugee crisis is the epitome of your message. I always like to say that Europa, the goddess, was our refugee in chief and should be faithful to her legacy. And the biggest hypocrisy of the EU is indeed the human rights discourse in contrast to what we do at our borders. So, and this is one more reason why your book needs to be read and why we need to discuss it, and thanking you for bringing it to us here.
Thank you so much, Calypso. Off to Miriam.
Thank you so much, Calypso. I already think there are a lot of similarities also that the comments I have. And thank you so much, Hans, for being here today and also for your really valuable contribution to the discourse I think we're having here at EUI. At the beginning, I just want to flag also where I'm coming from, because that's also what I really like about the book, that you start with a personal note and you explain why you have certain perspectives and how that has influenced also your way of writing this book. And I think in our disciplines we should do that more often, because then it becomes also more transparent how we see the world, and also how we understand or engage with the knowledge gaps we all have. And so I'm a Max Weber Fellow here, and I draw most of my knowledge from post-colonial feminist theories on regionalism, international relations, and that's also where mostly my comments are coming from. And the first thing is, like I said, I really like the starting point where you say it's rather a personal book. You say that you name the nationalities of your parents, and then for me, already that felt a little bit Eurocentric, to be honest, because like in the European context, mostly nationalities and passports are really important and define who we are and how also whiteness is defined. And and I know identities and the scale of also of being racialized is a big topic. But I was just wondering whether any identity markers, if you want to call them like that, that now looking back at the book, you think also played a huge part in the way actually you conceptualized whiteness and Europeanness. Just one example. I would never introduce myself and being like, I'm German. I would start with, I grew up more in an Islamic culture. I'm from this tribe. My family's from this kingdom. I have Ugandan heritage, and I grew up in Germany. If you want to do it like that. So I'm just really curious about that. Then coming more to the structure of the book, and also the structure of how I'm going to dive into the different concepts. I think what we can definitely see also in the book is the literature totally speaks to the topic, and I'm emphasizing that because often what we can witness with books on whiteness, on decentering, maybe Eurocentrism, that sometimes there's a clash with the literature that is being used and what's actually being said in the book. And of course, we have the classics like Frans Fanon, but you also have more contemporary literature like from Nima Begum, like the contribution is being European, a white identity that has emerged during one of the peaks of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I think that's definitely something I really enjoyed seeing, that these different forms of literatures come together from different periods of times. But then I was wondering, because at the end of the book, you have like a huge emphasis also on the Brexit, and then we can also see that the literature that is being used mostly speaks to the Brexit, and when it comes to whiteness, etc., etc. And I felt like, in my perspective, a really significant work, especially from feminist scholars, was not there really. For example, like Fatima El Tayeb, like she wrote a piece in 2008, The Birth of a European Public, Migration, Post-Nationality and Race in the Uniting of Europe. Then outside of the academic work, we have Rukaya Diallo, who's like a journalist and speaks a lot about anti-blackness, but also on Islamophobia in France and in Europe in general. And then, which is also often in general, being sidelined in the discourse about whiteness in Europe, is the question also, where do we position, for example, Roma and Sinti? Like, how does this come into play? The discrimination and also like exclusion of Roma and Sinti. And there, for example, a really good contribution is by Angela Kotches. She writes on post-colonial racism and social justice, especially from the Roma and Sinti perspective. So we talked about that also before. It's just there's so much out there, and I think books like yours also like are an invitation for us to think about which kind of literature we can combine in talking about these topics. Then when it comes to the structure, for me as a reader, I really liked how you structured the book, starting with what European regionalism actually can also offers or can't offer, and kicks off thoughts about what do we actually define as a region. We call Europe, asking ourselves, does it start maybe in Russia? Does it maybe start in Morocco? You mentioned it. Does it maybe start in Georgia? Just to stimulate our critical thoughts. And then it's also like perfectly connected with the more profound question about these different ideas we have, what it actually means to be European, like be civilized, be like then the European Union soft power fighting for human rights. So I think that was a really nice and helpful connection. And I wanted to check the time. Maybe I didn't stop there with the structure. And because I will come back to the Brexit issue at the end. And I also think that, so you mentioned also the aims of the book, right? What you want to do with the book. And there I was just thinking, who is the audience of your book, right? Because you say that actually the connection between the terms European and white has received surprisingly little attention. And I would argue that. So I'm just wondering, like, who do you have in mind when you say that? Because again, like going beyond the really Eurocentric perspective on what is Europe, I think many of us have put a lot of attention to that, what's going on in Europe and whiteness. So I only have 1 minute left, so I will do it really short. Sometimes I had the impression in the book, especially when it comes to othering, that really important aspects were missing to see the greater picture. For example, you list, for example, like othering from Islam to Russia to the United States. So I'm just also wondering, for example, we know that in Europe there's a huge and really long history of anti-Semitism. Why this is not really addressed in the book, or then more like on other pages. And the last thing, which I think is really, really important, and for me, it was the most curious aspect actually of your book, is the connection between Eurocentrism and whiteness. Because you asked you make the argument that perhaps the Brexit could also be seen as a chance to move away from Eurocentrism. And I definitely see like parts of the arguments, but then I also want to ask the question, maybe it's more helpful to not just only talk about one Eurocentrism, more like plural ones, and also how they interconnect with each other, and what then they do have to do with whiteness, if we really take the Eurocentrism away, if it's even possible. So I stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Miriam. Last but definitely not least, Glenda.
I feel sorry. It's such an art to bring together so much new literature and history and and of course, political thinking in a book like this. So, it's sort of unfair to kind of keep throwing, lobbying more and more questions at you in that context. And I agree with many of the points in your book, and like Calypso, I assume there'd be very little argument about the general argument, or the depiction of the problematic sides of Europe. And indeed, the value of your book for me is also the way in which someone like you can take all this different historiography that's out there now, and that you acknowledge, in the text, and kind of ask questions on that basis and bring it together. I did think Euro-Christianity could be another title, but anyway, but it's not as catchy as Eurowhiteness. So I really wanted to just ask a few questions that based on what interested me in the book, on broadly on the role of history in thinking about the present, and to ask really, what is Europe in this historical backstory and how it affects your argument? Because one of the interesting things I thought is that, I don't think you do enough to bring Britain into that story, really. And I'd want to extend everything you say about Europe to Britain as, a key actor in that Europe idea through the, the post-Enlightenment, pre-post-Enlightenment period. And a key actor in defining the boundaries of Europe, who's in and who's out, etc. And so in that context, what difference does it make if you keep Britain out of the story, if you put it back in until the present? And of course, it then extends to also the question of how the refugee crisis defines what Europe is and what Britain is. I'm going to come back to to an historical point in a minute. I find and other people in the room might have something to say about your use of Hans Kohn and nationalism theory. I do remember, so the high point of nationalism studies was the 90s, right? And then it sort of dropped off. And at that point, I think people had said, and I myself would have said, civic, cultural, I don't know, because, if we take the feminist literature, for example, civic was already still loaded culturally, right? It was very difficult to sort of separate out a civic reading. And I think, much of the history that you recount would reinforce that, particularly once one puts race, gender, and class back into the story of civic politics in the 19th and some of the 20th century in this Europe. We can talk about Beck and cosmopolitized versus cosmopolitan Europe if you like, but I was also interested in your economic argument. I wondered if you could say more about that, and because here I'm thinking about, what is the potential of this history for thinking about, I guess back to Calypso's point, ways of opening up, right, the idea of Europe and its potential. And you talk about a particular kind of Europe associated with the welfare state, and which could be Britain too. Anyway, the British Europe and Europe. And so, what role this economic dimension of the European past plays. So the last point is another one about history and policy and where one goes with the past. I was very interested, so I know in your book you use Quinn Slobodian, and Quinn's someone you acknowledge, and the Eurafrica idea is central to the historical story and the ways in which Eurafrica informs, as you said, the EU as a project of, rescuing the empire as much as rescuing the nation state. It's symptomatic of it, maybe even a method of it, in ambition at least. But I was quite interested recently in an op-ed for The Statesman on the delusion of a new European empire. Quinn actually, I thought, did something quite interesting with this idea. And he argued that old forms of thinking about world order were mutating in new conditions. And he used some of the same material that you're drawing on, Megan Brown's work on Algeria, etc. And he says, taking on board these facts need not leave one with the impression of an EU that is rotten to the core. They can also illuminate how independence in an interconnected world was always a relative quality, and that empire and nation were never simple binaries. And then he talks about Piketty and Fred Cooper's work. In fact, there's a new book by Fred Cooper and Jane Burbank on Eurasia and Africa and Afro-Asia as post-imperial possibilities. So it's that idea, right? So that the idea that what's at stake are different ways in which we can see the world, and how do we evade the tyranny of existing concepts and practices that make it hard for us to see emergent political forms. So it's still about taking, I guess, away from the idea of Europe, as much as Euro-Africa, another way of seeing the world that opens up the world rather than closes it down and shuts down borders, right? So I thought it might be useful for you to, tell us more about how you think about the possibility.
Thank you to you as well. This was a lot of food for thought. Can I give you about 3 minutes to cherry pick some of the points you would like to address right away, and then I'm sure afterwards with different questions and comments we can engage with more of the comments that were already made.
Absolutely. So, look, first of all, thank you. They're all fantastic sets of comments, very rich, and obviously I'm not going to be able to respond to all of them. Some of them I need to process a bit, and in any case, I don't have time to respond to all of them. Normally, when I respond to these comments, when I talk about the book, I sort of pick out 2 or 3 big ones. I think I might try and do sort of maybe 6 quick responses in this case. So, first of all, and in a way, this may be the most important point I think that I want to say something about, Calypso, on this question around race and whiteness, right? Am I essentially, obviously with the choice of the title, kind of emphasizing race as opposed to empire, or religion, right? Because that's what I was going to say was, I thought about the book title, and I wasn't sure if I was going to go ahead with it at one point. Part of the reason I did was because I think it's really important to make this point, that we can't neglect race in Europe. And I think that's the tendency. I think there are multiple ways in which Europeans try to avoid the race question, and especially in the context of the EU, but more broadly in Europe. One way is to say, it's fine to talk about empire, but race, and in particular whiteness, is inappropriate. That's an American import. I hear this particularly in France, by the way. This doesn't work in the European context, to which I normally say to these people, particularly French people, have you heard of the Code Noir? The Code Noir, the French edict governing slavery in the French colonies, which uses the language of colour, right? So I think race and whiteness is absolutely relevant in the European context, and I think we're in complete denial about it. And I think there are multiple ways of being in denial about it. As I say, one is to say, let's talk about empire but not race. Another way to talk about it is to say, let's talk about class but not race, right? Because class somehow plays the role that race plays in the United States. Another way of doing it is to say, let's talk about religion but not about race. I think we have to talk about race. And my rough reading, as you say, there's vast amounts of literature, a lot of which I haven't read, but my sense of where we are is that we have now a really extensive literature on whiteness, but most of it's in the American context. And we don't have a clear understanding yet of how whiteness has functioned in the European context. I'm thinking here particularly of historical work. So, for example, if you think of a book like Theodore Allen's, we have a very specific history of the first time in the American context that the idea of whiteness emerges. We have a date, right? We have a history of this now. And here's though, we don't have this about Europe. As far as I know, nobody's written a book that shows you how, in the French context, it's, as I mentioned the Code Noir, exactly how this happens. And then Theodore Allen has a whole argument about why it happens, right? I don't think we yet have that. And by the way, as an illustration of why I think this is a false distinction between Europe and the United States, Theodore Allen's work is about the English colony of Virginia, right, before it's the United States. So I think of this all as one story. Europe and the United States. And I think we have a very imbalanced sense of this. So, I'm not claiming to fill this gap in my book, but I am trying to point to it. Secondly, on your point, Calypso, about, the book is kind of Eurocentrism because it doesn't look at how the rest of the world sees the EU. No, of course, you're right. That's what this book is trying to do. It's about how the EU imagines itself. It's not about how the rest of the world sees the EU. It's a story of how the EU imagines itself. And look, you're of course also right that there are multiple things going on at any different moment. I think you're slightly, in what you said, I think you're slightly conflating cosmopolitanism, the idea of a cosmopolitan Europe, with federalism. Those to me seem like two distinct things. But what I'm really pointing to is the shifts over time. That's the story I try to tell, is how some of these things shift over time, because that, the cosmopolitan Europe moment was in the 90s and 2000s. I don't think anybody thinks like that anymore. And I'm not claiming that everybody thought that way, that Habermas did and Beck did in the 1990s and 2000s, but I think it was a more powerful current at that time than it is now. Then, Miriam, on your questions about the audience, I'm really glad you asked me that question, because I have to say, in a way, this book is aimed at a British audience. And part of the reason it's aimed at a British audience, and this is in particular why I ended the book in the way that I did, without saying how the EU can solve these problems, but talking about what, if my thesis in the first 5 chapters is right, what does this mean for Britain, a post-Brexit Britain, right? I chose to end in that way precisely for this reason. And part of the reason for that, frankly, is that I have been told in the last, 7 years by pro-Europeans, it's no longer any of your business. We're not interested in what you think. And so, as I say, I focus then on, as a British citizen, let me think about what this means for Britain. Now, it's really nice to now be able to kind of talk to continental Europeans and to be asked, help us think about how you reverse the civilizational turn in the European project. But I'm happy to sort of think about that. That, by the way, is where the economic story comes in, because very, very briefly, essentially what I'm arguing is that the reason you have the civilizational turn, the reason you get this shift to ethnic cultural ways of thinking about Europe is precisely because of the neoliberalization of the EU. And here, by the way, you have to say this is partly a British thing, right? Because the single market was a Thatcherite project. And so, the story I essentially tell, or the argument is that, precisely because in the context of the euro in particular, but there's a longer history of this, I think, economic policy has been taken out of the space of democratic contestation in the European Union, especially in the Eurozone, well then your politics shifts to cultural questions. And so the way to reverse the civilizational turn, I think, is to repoliticize economic policy in the EU. And here again is partly why, I'm writing a book aimed at Brits rather than at continental Europeans, because if you really ask me, how do you solve this problem in the EU? Part of my answer will be, I think you have to get rid of the euro. And I'm not sure that many continental Europeans want to hear that. And then finally, Glenda, on the ethnic civic distinction, I totally take your point that it's probably too simple, the ethnic civic distinction. But I think it's a good place to start. I think as a conceptual distinction, it does, there's something to it. And what I argue in that first chapter is that, Hans Korn essentially sort of says that some nationalisms, like American nationalism, is purely civic, and some, like German nationalism, are purely ethnic cultural. I'm saying that's way too simple. In every nationalism, you have a mixture of both. And they interact in some really complex ways, and they're really tightly connected to the point where, it may not even make sense anymore, but I think it's not a bad place to start in terms of thinking about different kinds of nationalism and, by extension, different kinds of regionalism.